I'd like to call the Tuesday, November 26, 2024 Housing and Redevelopment Authority meeting to order. The first item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda. Is there any additions or corrections to this evening's agenda? Hearing none, we'd be looking for a motion to approve the Tuesday, November 26, 2024 agenda.
So moved.
We have a motion by Commissioner Mua
Second.
and a second by Commissioner Carter to approve this evening's agenda. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes 4-0. Moving on to item 3.1. It's the approval of the November 12th, 2024 HRA board meeting minutes. Is there any questions, additions, corrections to the November 12th minutes? Hearing and seeing none, we'd be looking for a motion to approve the November 12th, 2024 HRA board meeting minutes.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion by Commissioner Mueller and a second by Commissioner Mua to approve the November 12th, 2024 HRA board meeting minutes. Any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes 4-0. We're skipping down to new business, item 5.1, the adoption of utility allowance schedule for Bloomington HRA rent assistance programs. May we have the staff report, please?
Yes, good evening, Chair and Commissioners. The item before you tonight is related to the Housing Choice Voucher Program, more specifically, and just a little background about utility allowances. They're calculated, their calculation is important is an important component of the gross rent calculation used in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and the allowances are based on an average consumption of an energy conservative household. Bloomington HRA utilizes the utility allowance adopted by the Metropolitan Council just because we are in the same market area rather than duplicating that work. The reason this is before you tonight is there is a 10% change from the previous year, and so that is why it requires your approval before it can be adopted. Just want to call out a couple of the major changes that would impact tenants in our program. Natural gas has dropped significantly across the board, and conversely, electricity costs are increasing, but by a smaller margin. So overall, a total utility allowance we're anticipating for most households is actually going to go down, which means their gross rent calculation would go down, which actually, especially for households that are moving in the next year, could mean that more housing options are available to them. Specifically, I think the greatest impact would be for households that are looking for single-family rentals because they tend to have the higher utility allowance costs. So this is actually going to potentially have a good impact for some of the households on our program. So again, the request from staff tonight is to approve the attached utility allowance schedule, and it would be effective January 1st of 2025.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Commissioner Mua.
Thank you. So you said this is tied to the Met Council numbers. Did they recently update them, I'm assuming? And they do that? Do they do that every single year?
Yes, thank you, Chair, Commissioner Mua. They reevaluate the numbers on an annual basis, and they also are adopting this updated utility allowance schedule to be effective for January 1st of 2025. So we are following their same process.
Any other questions? Seeing no other questions, we'd be looking for a motion to approve the attached utility allowance schedule for use in the Housing Choice Voucher and other rent assistance programs effective January 1st, 2025.
So moved.
We have a motion by Commissioner Mueller
Second.
and a second by Commissioner Mua to approve the attached utility allowance schedule. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion passes 4-0. Moving on to item 5.2, Property Maintenance Service Agreement. May we have the staff report on that, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So this item is kind of a continuation of a conversation that we have been having with the board regarding a restructuring of how we, excuse me one second. Of how we structure our approach to our property management of the 42 properties we own and operate single-family rental properties within the city. The final phase of this restructuring that's taken place over the last year is to execute an agreement with a property maintenance company. And the goals with this agreement are to have a provider who can provide that first layer of service to tenants, especially for emergent situations. They would go into the properties, assess the situation, and complete any necessary immediate repairs. Additionally, under this contract would be some non-emergency work orders, including those submitted by tenants, and preventative maintenance tasks. Earlier this year, staff completed an informal bidding process for these services and selected Renew Homes, Inc. Renew Homes demonstrated capacity to provide the necessary 24-hour on-call services that were desired. Their bid also stood out for their approach to the services, including building relationships with tenants and serving as a partner alongside staff to assess potential risks and future maintenance needs at properties in a way that we didn't necessarily see from other providers that provided quotes. They are also certified in lead, safe work practices, mold remediation, and Inspire, all of which are super relevant for our properties due to their age and the programs that we run through the homes. The proposed agreement of $88,000 would cover on-call and emergency services and some non-emergency work orders on a monthly basis. And we see this as the minimum, most immediate level of maintenance needs for our properties. As we've discussed previously, staff is in the process of developing both a preventative maintenance and capital improvement plan for our properties, and we anticipate this work will better define additional maintenance needs beyond the emergency on-call services that would be covered under this agreement. And so at this time, staff is proposing a 6-month agreement with the option to extend for an additional 6 months. And this 6-month structure would give us the opportunity to expand or renegotiate services once we have those plans in place in 2025. So staff is requesting approval to enter into a services agreement with Renew Homes, Inc. for property maintenance services for HRA-owned rental properties for 6 months for a not to exceed amount of $88,000.
Are there any questions? Commissioner Mua.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to understand what the plan is to evaluate the services of the services company. Once we get through the initial 6 months, and then if we do choose to extend the additional 6 months, what ultimately means that they were successful? How do we categorize that? And then is this an ongoing thing if they are effective in what they're doing?
Thank you, Chair, Commissioner Mua. So just to reiterate, to make sure I understand the question, is how are we evaluating success under this agreement, and what would be the thresholds we would use to determine if we were going to extend? I think there's a couple of factors that we are considering within this. I think most critically is ability to respond in a timely manner to the 24-hour emergencies. I think that is a gap in service that we've had historically that we want to make sure is covered under this contract. So that would be something that would be a top priority. I think another contributing factor, honestly, would be cost, and making sure that the costs within this contract are a competitive price, understanding the age of our homes and the degree of need in some of the homes. So those are kind of the two costs I think we would consider once we're at 6 months, whether or not we would move forward with another 6 months.
And then one follow-up on the cost piece. What is the process to approve emergency services? Is there going to be a dollar amount? Is there going to be, someone that they have to call from the city to get approval for something? How are we setting that up?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, Commissioner Mua. The way we've currently structured it is they would be the first kind of responders to those immediate needs, and under the contract, it's a flat rate that essentially we're paying for them to provide that service. They would address any immediate concerns. So say, in an example, there was a leak, they would turn off the water, identify where that leak is happening, and essentially give us an assessment of what would the final repair need to be. Within the contract, we do have some structure of they would come back then, once that immediate problem at a later date, to solve the final repair, and we have a dollar amount within the contract for providing those services. Over $1,000, so anything that would cost over $1,000 is then when we would go out and receive multiple bids to complete that larger scale repairs outside of the contract.
Sorry, there's lots of questions this is triggering. So over $1,000, we would have to go out to get bids. Is there concern about delivery of service, right? So like say we're in the middle of winter, your water heater breaks and it's over $1,000 and we have to go out and bid to get better pricing, which is what we need to do, but that leaves the resident without hot water for extra time. Is there concern of delivery of service if that's kind of a limitation that we're going to have?
Thanks, Chair. Commissioner Mua, for the question. Under our requirements under state law, there are some specific emergent situations that we have to resolve within 24 hours. Also under Inspire, there's circumstances that we would need to resolve within 24 hours. Water heater is a great example of one that we would need to resolve, and I think for those we would use a more expedited process to bring hot water back to the service back to the family.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Hearing no other questions, we'd be looking for a motion to approve Resolution 2024-24, authorizing staff to enter into an agreement between Renew Homes, Inc. and the Housing and Redevelopment Authority in and for the City of Bloomington.
So moved.
We have a motion by Commissioner Mua.
Second.
Second by Commissioner Mueller to approve Resolution 2024-24. Is there any discussion? Hearing and seeing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion passes 4-0. Moving on to item 5.3, Direct Income-Based Assistant Program for the Heights. May we have the staff report?
Thank you, Chair and Commissioners. So this is a follow-up item from both the October 22nd HRA meeting, where you initially considered the HIA request and associated financing for the Heights. That then went to the City Council on November 18th. On that meeting, the City Council did open a public hearing and had a hearing for interested parties, and on staff's recommendation deferred final decision on the full financing package to December 2nd, with indication that there would be a vote of support. And as part of that deferral, the staff also intended to bring back the program structure for the proposed direct income-based assistance program to the HRA for final approval. And so that's the item that we're discussing tonight. But I do want to make it clear that the funding for this program would be considered and potentially would be considered at the December 2nd City Council meeting. So we're considering a program structure ahead of funding. So I do want to make that clear. But yes, for tonight we'll be discussing the proposed program structure for the direct income-based assistance program. And so this program is recommended by staff to close the gap between what's considered an affordable housing cost relative to the amount of income that a household brings in. So the proposed structure follows a methodology that we'll go through later. There is a PDF in your packet that I figured we could just talk through live and get to an understanding on that. And so the inclusion of this program in the overall financing, the overall associated financing of the HIA request is intended to address the housing cost for those most cost-burdened households. So those are the households that when you factor in the HIA fee on top of all of their other housing costs, that those housing costs will exceed 30% of their monthly income. And so there was an expectation that because of the high financial burden that is likely to result from the HIA, requested HIA, that some households may not be able to cover their housing costs in an affordable way with their monthly income. So to talk through the proposed structure, we'll go through the methodology later, but I did want to talk through how this proposed program would be administered. So as you're aware, the HRA administers its the home improvement loan program, homeowner improvement loan program. So that's the CDBG and also HRA budget funded program for homeowners to get rehab improvements on their home. And so the proposal for the direct income-based assistance program is that it would be administered within that same framework in terms of application intake and eligibility consideration. And so what that framework is, it's actually the framework established by HUD. And it's also used for the Section 8 program. And so there's a standard list of income documents, asset documents that are requested for the applicant to provide. And then there's a standardized calculation that's done with those documents to determine what a household's income is. So we have existing staff capacity to intake those applications and then determine eligibility of those households. So that's one thing I wanted to call out. The proposed structure for how this funding would reach the applicant, the unit owner, is that it would reduce the HIA assessment fee that owner is responsible for before it goes to assessment. So that's why there's a bit of a truncated timeline on this. We want to understand what the need is and how that funding gets allocated before this goes to assessment, because once it goes to assessment, that will include the interest, which is expensive, of course. So once we determine eligibility, that funding gets allocated to a household. We are then able to lower what their prepayment fee is, and the remaining balance is what is assessed, and the interest would only be on that remaining balance. So through that, we're able to lower the payments that unit owner is responsible for. The securitization of that assistance comes through a forgivable loan. So similarly, to some of our other assistance programs, we record, basically it's a secondary mortgage on the unit, on the home, and that has a term, in this case, that coincides with the financing for the HA, so 20 years. And at the end of that 20-year period, that funding is forgiven. It's not required that it's repaid. If the homeowner decides to sell their unit or transfer their unit before that 20-year period, they would be expected to repay that assistance back to the city, back to the HRA, and that would most likely come out of the proceeds of their home sale. They would have that option to pay out of the proceeds of their home sale. They could also choose to repay as part of the wider HIA assistance package. We've allowed for early payoff during that 20-year term, and so early payoff would also include repayment of the assistance. So the early repayment conditions are outlined in the proposed structure. The last thing I'll highlight before we go to the methodology is that this assistance can go to unit owners who are owner occupants and also to unit owners who are renting their units out. But if the applicant is renting the unit out, they'll have to agree to putting in place a restriction that their unit is rented to a household, rented at an affordable rent for households at 60% that are earning 60% AMI or less, and that would be for that full term of the assistance, so that full 20 years. And then same if they are an owner occupant, we'll have to document that they're earning 60% AMI or less. So I think with that, if you could pull up the methodology, please, we can go through that, and then we can take on some discussion. So I tried to outline what the kind of the flow of consideration is for how we get to a final allocation of funding. Thank you. So it's kind of a flow chart. Hopefully that made sense, but we can just go through slide by slide. So as I mentioned, eligible households, whether that's for ownership or for units that are eventually being rented, that's at that 60% AMI level. And so I've put in, these are all just estimated numbers, random numbers, but they're all eligible from an income standpoint. So those are some potential monthly incomes. They actually vary from as low as that 30% AMI level up to the 60%, just to show, as we'll get to later, severity of need. So that's where we're getting monthly income. The calculation for housing cost is inclusive of principal and interest on a homeowner's mortgage. It's inclusive of their tax payments, their property taxes. It's inclusive of insurance for their property. And then it's also inclusive of their HOA dues and the proposed HIA fee. So that's what's rolled up into monthly housing cost. And then to get our affordable housing cost, it's simply 30% of their monthly income. So with those numbers, we can establish what the housing cost gap is for each household. And I just included a household that, for a demonstration, wouldn't be eligible. So household 4, even though they would be paying that expensive HIA fee, they are actually earning enough income for that to be considered affordable. So they wouldn't be eligible for this program. But the other 3 households they have demonstrated that they're eligible, and we have established a housing cost gap. So next, we'll take those housing cost gaps, and we're applying a ratio showing for their gap to their income, what is the ratio there. And the reason that we're doing that is to establish what the severity of their need is. In the program structure, we emphasized that this is a direct and needs-based assistance program, and so priority will be given to households that have the highest demonstrated need. So that's why we've included this ratio as part of the calculation. So once we have a ratio established, I'm just tallying up the ratio to establish the percent of total need. So that percent of total need is just each household's ratio out of the total ratio. So once I have that percentage of total need, I simply applied that to, for example, for this demonstration, I just used $125,000. So applying that percentage to that total amount to get a direct assistance amount. And you can see, even though, I guess I'll go back a couple slides, the housing cost gap for household 2 isn't much higher than household 3, but you'll see their assistance amount is much higher. And the reason for that is that relative to their income, their housing cost gap is much higher. The ratio of gap to income is much higher than household 3. So that's just to demonstrate that we're establishing priority for that household which has the highest severity of need. And then in terms of the max allowed assistance, there are 2 caps. One would be that gap is covered for the entirety of the 20 years. If we're able to have enough funding, that would be one cap. The other cap would be what their total prepayment fee is, and that total prepayment fee is what's established in the fee resolution that the City Council will consider on December 2nd. And basically, it's their portion of the project cost. So I included the household 2 just to show that in their case, they were capped by the cost of the project. And so that's where their assistance ended. So that's the methodology. Happy to talk through it and then discuss any components of the program as proposed.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Commissioner Carter.
Thank you. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around how it all works. And so, like on this slide for the eligible households, household 1, it says direct assistance is $20,000, around $20,000. So does that, like, we're not, like, how do they get the money from the city to then pay for their portion of the assessment? Does that make sense?
Chair and Commissioners, thank you for that question. Yes, that absolutely makes sense. So the way that the money benefits the owner is that we reduce what they'll be required to pay from that prepayment fee. And that's that fee that's established in the resolution that the City Council will consider in the second. And it's their portion of the project cost. The reason that that's a benefit, besides it being paid on their behalf, is it doesn't end up going to assessment. So they're saving on interest. With this structure that we've proposed of paying down the assessment fee, the prepayment fee, the money never appears in the hands of the owner. It doesn't exit the city essentially, but it is repaying the interfund loan for the HRA. That's essentially the structure.
Got it. And then this is one time, right? So we would not be requiring them to provide proof of eligibility in an ongoing way. even though it's over the course of 20 years, like it's kind of a one-time thing. And then if their income goes up significantly next year, I mean, that is what it is, right? Okay, so I just wanted to make sure I was understanding how it kind of worked.
Chair and Commissioners, if I may, that I agree with what you just said, and that does mirror how it's handled for our other assistance programs, the rehab program. It's that one-time assistance. There aren't checks going on into the future. It would be for if there are unit owners that are renting their units and apply and receive this funding, those units would be rolled into our compliance program. So there would be that annual touch point to see that the rents are being set at that affordable level and that the households that are being rented to were within the income threshold.
Okay, great. I understand then. I'm pretty sure I understand. Are there other? So we are approving tonight the kind of the framework. Is that what you called it? The framework? Okay. Are there other ways to do this that staff considered, but you decided that this approach was the best approach?
Chair and Commissioners, there were some other considerations of how the funding would be directed to the homeowner. So just to talk through some of those, it would be potentially just a lump sum assistance going directly to the owner. Then they would be responsible for deploying that funding. Our expectation is they'd be using it for housing costs, but the concern was there's no oversight in that scenario. So that was why this proposal was put forward. The other proposal would be, I think you kind of alluded to it, would be checking like multiple payments over the lifetime of the assistance. So there was different terms thought about, potentially providing assistance annually for a certain period. That creates a lot of administrative burden. So this is the other benefit of this method is because the financial intervention is before the assessment, it creates that interest savings. And in that second scenario that I just outlined, because that payment occurs after the assessment, there's no savings there.
Yep.
So there was some discussion of other structures, and staff felt that this was the optimal structure.
Okay, thank you. That's super helpful. And I agree with staff's recommendation. I think this is a good solution, and I think especially because we have the WAHA funding that is for a purpose like this, we're not having to dip into other pots of money so I think it sounds good. Thank you.
Other questions?
I have a question.
Commissioner Mueller?
Chair, Commissioners,
Oh, I have a question.
please.
And maybe we've discussed this already, but what if, let's say in a year, someone's income goes down and they would now be eligible? Is there a process or procedure or option for that?
Chair and Commissioners, this funding as proposed is a one-time funding, and the application deadline is intended to be before it goes to assessment, and that funding would be deployed.
Okay.
And so the structure as proposed, it wouldn't cover this scenario that you've outlined. Chair and Commissioners, I did want to, Kim reminded me to bring up that because staff we haven't begun collecting data on the household's income, there isn't a strong estimation for what the need actually will be from unit owners at the Heights and how many households will be eligible. So the proposed amount that the council will consider on the second is for $250,000. There's no assurance that that is enough to finance the need. The other scenario that could be the case is that there are some households that have a very high demonstrated need, and with this ratio approach that benefits those with the most severe need, it may be that those households they're not able to have that full need met. So just want to be clear that because we haven't been able to collect that data yet, we don't have that full assurance of if the 250 is enough.
Commissioner Carter?
Thank you. And kind of on the opposite end of that, if you, let's just say there's 3 households and this is like a real scenario here, we could spend, we don't have to, you're not necessarily going to use all of the $250,000 because there are these max allowed assistance amounts per household. Yep, okay, thank you.
I have a question. If the need is there, let's say, and we come to find out that, the 250 isn't enough, could there be the option to approach for a request for more funding based on like future discussions?
Sure.
I mean, I understand that timeline is very short, so I do respect that. I'm just curious kind of where that timeline sits and what happens if there are those extreme needs. Could staff kind of, I think
Chair and Commissioner, yeah. So there are some major cutoff points in terms of action that the city must take. I think the main one is on February 10th, there would be that's our targeted date for resolution of bond sale. And so that's that $1 million bond that's part of the associated financing. That meeting would also include the consideration of the TIF district, establishing a TIF district. So those dates to me feel like very hard cutoffs. Currently, as proposed, this direct assistance program, we would start collecting applications on December 3rd, assuming that the City Council approves funding. And there would be a deadline of the first week of January to receive those applications. If staff were able to work very quickly to understand what the eligibility is, what that full need is, I would hopefully think we could bring back a request for additional funding within that small window. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Hearing no other questions, at this point we'd be looking for a motion to adopt resolution number 2024-26, which is a resolution approving a direct income-based assistance program and directing HRA staff to administer the program.
So moved.
We have a motion by Commissioner Carter
Second.
and a second by Commissioner Mueller to adopt resolution number 2024-26. Is there any discussion? Hearing no discussion, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion passes 4-0. Moving on to item 6, which is discussion items.
Hi, thanks, Chair. I just have a couple items I wanted to raise to this group. I acknowledge that we're not a full board tonight, so everything I mentioned tonight, I think we'll plan to follow up with an email with more information so everyone is on the same page. One thing I did want to bring up that we are exploring is introducing consent items to HRA board agendas. So this is allowed under our bylaws, but it is it would be a new structure that the board historically hasn't been using. But consent agenda items allow for a quick approval of standing annual items like the utility allowances, for example, covered under one vote. And the board would obviously have the ability to pull anything from the consent agenda if they wanted to have a more in-depth discussion. So this might come up in December board meetings that are coming up. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. Again, if we do move forward with that path, we would send an email with more information about what that structure would look like for those board meetings. And then if there's no questions about that, I can jump to my... Okay. The other thing I just wanted to remind all of you about is we do have a special meeting of the HRA board scheduled for December 10th, and that's a concurrent meeting with both the Port Authority and the City Council. Again, there'll be more information over email about how that structure is going to work, but I just wanted to use this time to remind you of that meeting.
Any questions or discussion on any of those? Perfect. I really like the consent agenda items. Thank you. So with that, we'd be looking for a motion to adjourn the Tuesday, November 26, 2024 Housing and Redevelopment Authority meeting.
So moved.
We have a motion by Commissioner Mua
Second.
and a second by Commissioner Mueller to adjourn the meeting. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion passes 4-0. We are adjourned.